Oxford rain slicks ancient stones as Inspector Morse discovers that some secrets refuse burial. A warden found dead, a poet misquoted, and 2 ceremonial knives where logic insists only one should be. In the shadow of St. Swithin's College, melancholy and murder intertwine like verses in a half-remembered song, where academic courtesy masks decades of betrayal, and the weight of institutional silence grows too heavy for even the most careful souls to bear. Where are you listening from tonight? Perhaps you're settled somewhere cozy with a warm drink, or maybe you're walking through your own historic streets where old stones might harbor secrets of their own. The rain had been falling since tea time, that peculiar Oxford rain which seems to arrive not from clouds, but from the very stones themselves, as if the city were weeping its accumulated centuries into the October dusk. I found myself crossing the quad of St. Swithin's College with no particular urgency, my footsteps echoing against the medieval walls in a rhythm that matched neither my heartbeat nor my thoughts. The cobblestones gleamed like old pewter under the lamplight, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, a piano was being played, Chopin, I thought, though the melody drifted and fragmented through the rain until it became something else entirely, something unnamed and unreachable. I had told myself I was here merely to return a library book, Houseman's collected poems borrowed 3 weeks ago in a moment of what I can only describe as educational nostalgia. The volume sat heavy in my coat pocket, its pages slightly swollen with moisture from my walk across the city. But if I am honest, and there seems little point in dishonesty when speaking to oneself in the small hours of memory, I'd come to St. Swithin's for the same reason I often found myself in such places, because the weight of solitude grows lighter among stones that have witnessed more loneliness than any single man could bear. The scent of wet leaves mingled with something else as I approached the porter's lodge, the faint aroma of pipe tobacco and that indefinable mustiness that clings to institutions where learning has been pursued for longer than most nations have existed. The lodge glowed with that particular warmth that comes from electric light filtered through old glass, a beacon of human comfort in the gathering gloom. The porter, a man named Hobbs, whose surname seemed almost too appropriate for his philosophical bent, looked up from his evening paper with the resigned expression of one who has spent decades managing the comings and goings of academics and their various neuroses. His face bore the indelible etchings of countless Oxford winters, and his eyes held a peculiar, almost solemn glint that I had not noticed in our previous encounters. "Good evening, Inspector," he said, though I had never told him my profession and suspected he had learned it through that peculiar osmosis by which college porters acquire knowledge about everyone who passes through their domain. "Returning something, are we, or collecting?" "Returning," I replied, placing the houseman on his desk with the small satisfaction that comes from completing even the most trivial of obligations, though I confess I'd hoped you might direct me towards somewhere I could collect a glass of wine and perhaps an hour's peace. Hobbs smiled with the satisfaction of a man who understands that all human desires eventually reduce to simple categories. "The senior common room is closed for refurbishment," he said, "but the Lamb and Flag does a decent claret, and they know how to leave a man in peace with his thoughts." It was then that I noticed the newspaper clipping pinned to the cork board beside the key rack, its edges already beginning to curl in the damp air. My gaze, as it often did in those days, was drawn to such details, the detritus of daily life that others passed by without seeing. The headline read simply, "College Warden Dies at Desk," and beneath it, in smaller type, "Dr. Helena Voss Found After Evening Service." The photograph showed a woman of perhaps 50, her dark hair pulled back severely, her eyes holding that particular intensity that comes from years of academic combat. She looked, I thought, like someone who had never learned to compromise, which in the context of college politics was either admirable or fatal. "Terrible business, that," Hobbs said, following my gaze with the weary resignation of one who has seen too many such notices pass through his domain. found her yesterday evening, slumped over her papers, like she'd simply decided to rest her eyes for a moment. Heart, they think, though she was young for it. Still, the stress of being warden would age anyone prematurely. I found myself studying the clipping more closely, noting the sparse details, the careful language that suggested uncertainty masquerading as fact. The article spoke of her being discovered after evensong, of a life dedicated to scholarship and administration, of the college's profound loss. Yet there was something in the measured tone, a curious absence of the visceral shock one might expect when death arrives so suddenly to one so young. "You knew her well?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would tell me more about the porter than about the deceased warden. "As well as anyone knew Helena Voss," Hobbs replied, and there was something in his tone that made me look up from the newspaper. "She was well loved," he continued, then paused in that way that suggests a speaker is editing his thoughts in real time, weighing each word against some internal scale of discretion, or at least well obeyed. The phrase settled upon me with unexpected weight, lingering in the air between us like incense after a service. It was the kind of observation that, delivered with such casual precision, spoke volumes about the intricate power dynamics that governed these ancient institutions. Well-loved suggested affection, genuine regard, the sort of mourning that comes from the heart. Well-obeyed hinted at something else entirely. Respect born of authority, perhaps, or even fear, a subtle undercurrent of compliance rather than devotion. It implied a certain detachment, a strategic distance maintained by the deceased warden, a woman whose passing might be more a matter of administrative inconvenience than profound grief for some. Outside, the piano music had stopped, leaving only the sound of rain against the windows and the distant chiming of the college clock marking another quarter hour in the endless progression of academic time. The silence felt expectant, as if the very stones were holding their breath. I thanked Hobbs and prepared to step back into the quad, but something had shifted in the quality of the evening. The rain felt colder now, more insistent, and the shadows cast by the lamps seemed to hold shapes that had not been there before. I told myself I was being fanciful, that the death of a college warden was a matter for the coroner and the college council, not for a detective inspector who had come here seeking nothing more than the return of a borrowed book and the temporary comfort of solitude. But as I walked toward the main gate, I found my steps slowing, my attention caught by details that should have been irrelevant. The way the light fell across the warden's lodgings, the absence of any sign of disturbance in the perfectly ordered quad, the fact that someone had already removed the brass nameplate from beside her door. The investigative instinct, once awakened, is difficult to quiet, and I realized that despite my intentions, despite my desire for a simple evening of wine and contemplation, I had already begun to see St. Swithin's College not as a place of learning, but as a scene waiting to be read. The porter's casual observation echoed in my mind, well loved, or at least well obeyed, and I found myself wondering what stories lay hidden behind that careful distinction, what secrets had died with Helena Voss in her perfectly ordered rooms. The lodge clock chimed again, 8 deep notes that seemed to resonate not just through the air, but through time itself, connecting this moment to all the other moments when that same bell had marked the passage of hours for scholars and servants, for the living and the dead. I pulled my coat closer against the rain and admitted to myself what I had perhaps known from the moment I saw that newspaper clipping. The case had begun, though no one yet admitted it, least of all the detective inspector who had come here seeking nothing more than the peaceful return of a volume of poetry, and had found instead another mystery written in the ancient language of human frailty and institutional silence. The morning arrived at the station with the tired light that Oxford saves for detectives and pigeons, pale and scholarly, as if the sun itself had been required to pass examinations before illuminating the ancient stones. Lewis had departed with statements requiring typing. Strange was sequestered with someone who remembered his rank, but not his temperament, and I found myself nursing coffee whose optimism had long outlived its flavor. The envelope appeared with the internal post, placed beside my telephone with a silent precision that suggested someone understood the difference between routine correspondence and something more deliberately crafted. The paper was unremarkable. Cream-colored, neither expensive nor cheap, the sort one might purchase at any high-street stationer without inspiring memory or attracting notice. But the handwriting struck me with uncomfortable force. Elegant, yet deliberately ambiguous, neither overtly masculine nor distinctly feminine, as if the writer had practiced disguising their natural script until deception became as fluid as honesty. My name appeared in careful capitals, each letter formed with the precision of someone who understood that penmanship could serve as either revelation or concealment. Inside lay a single line, stark and troubling, "Et in Arcadia, am." The phrase carried weight beyond its brevity, classical Latin that any educated person would recognize from Poussin's painting or countless literary references, the reminder that death exists even in paradise, that mortality shadows every earthly pleasure. Yet something about it troubled me with persistent unease, a wrongness I could not immediately identify but could not dismiss. I found myself speaking the words aloud, testing their sound against memory until the error revealed itself with uncomfortable clarity. The missing letter made a draft in the room. Et in Arcadia, ego sum would be correct. I, too, am in Arcadia. But this version had been truncated, abbreviated, the ego absent like a body that had lost its warmth. One small word missing, and the sentence lost its grammar as completely as a life loses its purpose. Who, I wondered, misquotes Poussin's tomb so confidently? The omission might have been accidental, a lapse of memory or education, but I suspected otherwise. Someone had deliberately altered the classical reference, transforming a philosophical meditation on mortality into something more pointed and more personal. By late morning, I was walking under the cloister toward the warden's rooms, the college air rinsed clean by night rain and the bells rehearsing for services they had witnessed countless times before. A constable waited outside with an expression that combined reverence and boredom in equal measure. The door yielded to the master key with a small, reluctant click, admitting me to chambers that spoke of a life lived with meticulous precision. Helena Voss had inhabited these rooms with the authority of someone who understood that power must be performed as well as exercised. The space smelled as ordered places do, polish and paper, and faintly, beneath everything else, the ghost of last week's lilies. Precision had colonized every surface, papers tied into discrete bundles with green ribbon, each bundle labeled in handwriting that made even the letter G look authoritarian. A ledger lay open on the desk to a page headed Capital Projects, East Range Roof, columns of numbers so primly aligned they could have been monks at prayer. On a side table, a pen rested exactly at right angles to a blotter, as if someone had used a ruler to ensure geometric perfection. On the window ledge, a wooden block held 6 knives, their handles aligned as if awaiting inspection. Not ornamental blades, but practical implements, the sort any sensible kitchen would prize for their balance and sharpness. No missing tooth in that serried jaw, or not yet, though I felt the small stir of interest that attends future absences. One handle bore a faint ring of dulled sheen, as if wiped with haste in the wrong direction. Beside the block, a letter opener shaped like a quill pretended usefulness it had never achieved. Paper yields differently to steel than flesh does, and this blade had known only the former. The pathologist received me at the John Radcliffe Hospital with the professional courtesy of someone accustomed to translating violent death into language that officials could comprehend without being overwhelmed by horror. Dr. Margaret Ashworth spoke in cautious clauses, extending courtesies rather than certainties. It could have been natural causes, she said in the tone of one offering a possibility rather than a conclusion. There existed hearts that stopped without warning, heads that yielded when struck from minor falls. She had found a bruise that did not persuade her and blood pressure readings that did not refute her preliminary assessment. When I pressed about sharper possibilities, she blinked with the wariness of a doctor who disliked theories that extended beyond observable evidence. Perhaps, she allowed, though her examination had revealed no obvious wound, no clear indication of external violence that would transform suspicious death into obvious murder. The cause of death remained frustratingly ambiguous, balanced between natural failure and something more deliberate, requiring further investigation to tip the scales toward certainty. The college's response revealed institutional reflexes perfected over centuries of managing inconvenient truths. Academic courtesy became armor, protecting secrets behind walls of polite cooperation that offered assistance while providing nothing of substance. Manners served as shields here, deflecting inquiry with practiced ease. The sub-warden received me with elegance learned from years of crisis management, speaking in the dialect of institutional preservation, appreciation, shock, continuity, while offering nothing a court would recognize as information. I began to sketch my cast because that is how my mind makes maps of human complexity. Dr. Serena Keel, the classic's Dawn, possessed posture like a blade and diction sharpened against Greek choruses. She praised Helena Voss in sentences. That looked correct, but sounded like something else entirely, her academic composure suggesting depths of feeling carefully controlled. When she quoted classical sources, she did so without citation, and my ear detected the faintest misstep. How present tense consented to become past in her mouth, transforming possibility into limitation with surgical precision. Marcus Bligh, the bursar, was genial and fleshy, quick to smile, the sort of man who could request money without appearing to do so. He wore fatigue like a silk tie no longer fashionable but too expensive to discard, speaking of Helena's dedication to the college's financial stability, while his eyes held shadows that suggested knowledge he could not share without violating confidences extending beyond professional discretion into personal loyalty. His concern for institutional reputation seemed almost as profound as his grief. Tom Rook moved among his stainless steel domain with priestly authority, understanding that a good chef knows where every blade lives as surely as a choir boy knows where every psalm begins. He showed me his kingdom with justified pride that did not court approval, speaking of inventory systems and proper blade maintenance. If a knife had gone missing, he could have told me to the half hour, but would not admit he could have. Such admission would betray his order of service. The Reverend Edwin Preece offered tea and prayer, as if both were sacraments reserved for those who doubted everything. His gentle intensity suggested someone who wrestled with questions admitting no final answers, but continued seeking truth through accumulated wisdom rather than revealed certainty. He had begun composing memorial verses, and I noticed the first letters of his lines idling towards something that looked older than grief, forming patterns that might have been accidental or might have been something more deliberate. Jonah Ellison wore poverty with the pride of someone who knew it would not love him back, but refused to be ashamed of the relationship. His eyes held the particular hollow look of someone who had seen the inside of an overdraft statement and concluded that arithmetic was indeed a moral science. He spoke of Helena Voss with mixture of gratitude and something that might have been guilt, suggesting relationships that extended beyond formal academic supervision into territories more complex and potentially more dangerous. Lydia Hart, the visiting novelist, possessed the observant stillness of someone perpetually taking mental notes for future fiction. She watched me with frank curiosity, someone accustomed to studying human behavior professionally, and I wondered what sort of character I might become in whatever story she was constructing from her temporary residence among the academics. Her questions about Helena Voss were phrased with precision that suggested she was already analyzing rather than merely inquiring. Each possessed alibis that were plausible without being perfect, explanations that satisfied surface inquiry while leaving room for deeper investigation. Serena had been supervising tutorials with undergraduates who blushed at the notion that something important had happened without them. Marcus had been at the Randolph with a donor whose check would never have cleared the bank of his own conscience. Tom had been inventing tomorrow's soup with professional dedication. Priest had been rehearsing responses that covered most spiritual contingencies. Jonah had been among books that smelled of dust and discipline. Lydia had been at a Blackwell's reading that no one had photographed. The warden's rooms yielded one final detail that settled in my consciousness with quiet insistence. A square of paper tucked beneath the ledger, a carbon copy of a memo about catering inventories written in the tidy hand I had already learned to recognize. The word knives had been underlined once, nothing unusual in an underlining, yet I placed it in my notebook with the modest interest one reserves for details that will not matter until suddenly they do. Back at the station, I positioned the Latin card beside the carbon copy and left a teaspoon between them as if they might breed understanding through proximity. Et in Arcadia Aeum. I wrote the missing ego in pencil and erased it again, presence and absence making their peculiar marriage in the space between certainty and doubt. The pathologist telephoned without committing herself to conclusions. The college sent condolences wrapped in clarity and promises of assistance, which, translated from institutional dialect, meant I would receive what I asked for when they decided it was safe to let me see it. As evening gathered over Oxford, I returned to the warden's rooms alone. The knives sat where they had sat before, mute and exact, their steel surfaces reflecting lamplight with the indifference of objects that had witnessed more than they would ever reveal. The air had settled into that peculiar quiet that offices acquire once life has departed, a tidy emptiness that mistakes the absence of noise for peace. I touched one handle with the back of my finger, as if such gentle contact might feel less like intrusion, but the blade offered nothing beyond its own cold certainty. The missing letter in the Latin phrase echoed in my consciousness as I walked back across the quad. Et in Arcadia, incomplete, deliberately truncated, carrying meaning that extended beyond classical reference into territories of personal accusation. Someone had sent me not just a message, but a puzzle, expecting me to understand both question and answer. The investigation had begun not with obvious evidence, but with careful questions. Not with clear solutions, but with the kind of ambiguous details that suggested truth would emerge only through patient attention to the spaces between what people said and what they carefully avoided saying. In Oxford, I had learned that was often where the real mysteries lived, in the silences between words, in the careful editing of truth, in the precise arrangement of facts that told stories their arrangers never intended to reveal. The case stretched before me like an unfinished crossword, each clue dependent on others, each answer revealing new questions that would require their own patient unraveling. The college kept its counsel, the suspects maintained their alibis, and I, who had never particularly enjoyed puzzles that refused to be solved quickly, prepared myself for the kind of investigation that would require not just evidence, but understanding of the human heart's capacity for both love and betrayal in equal measure. St. Swithin's College existed as a world entire, its honey-coloured stones having absorbed not merely centuries of Oxford rain, but the accumulated weight of human ambition, disappointment, and carefully guarded secrets. Walking through its corridors in those first days after Helena Voss's death, I found myself thinking that these walls had witnessed more confessions than any cathedral, more betrayals than any court. The college operated according to its own peculiar laws, where academic courtesy served as both sword and shield, where ancient traditions provided convenient camouflage for thoroughly modern sins. The morning air carried the scent of wet leaves and old parchment as I made my way to the medieval wing, where Dr. Serena Keel inhabited her rooms with the precision of a woman who understood that in academic warfare, every detail served as either weapon or weakness. She received me with the kind of measured politeness that Oxford dons deploy like armor, her dark hair pulled back severely, her eyes holding that particular sharpness that comes from years of intellectual combat. When she spoke of Helena Voss, praising the late warden's dedication to scholarship and administrative competence, I detected something else entirely beneath the careful recitation, a contempt so profound it had crystallized into professional courtesy, the way certain wines turn to vinegar while maintaining their original color. Her room smelled faintly of strong tea and aged paper, books aligned like soldiers prepared for a better war than the ones they were given. She moved a single paper knife on her mantel as if adjusting an idea, observing almost academically that death had a way of clearing agendas. When she mentioned Voss's recent decisions regarding college property, her voice carried the faintest tremor of suppressed fury, as if discussing not merely administrative policy, but personal betrayal. She quoted something classical about the futility of ambition, though I suspected her choice of wisdom was less about Voss's mortality and more about her own enduring presence within these hallowed halls. The bursar's office overlooked the main quad, its windows framing a view unchanged since the 15th century. Marcus Bligh met me with expansive warmth, the sort that had proved useful in extracting funds from reluctant benefactors. His manner was genial, almost avuncular, as he offered tea from a service that had seen better decades. He spoke fondly of Helena Voss as both colleague and friend, praising her vision for the college's future. Yet beneath this professional warmth, I noticed how his hands trembled slightly when he reached for his cup, how his eyes drifted toward filing cabinets with an expression suggesting they contained more than mere financial records. When our conversation turned to recent capital expenditures, his genial manner acquired a defensive edge, and he began speaking in the careful language of a man navigating between competing loyalties without quite satisfying any. The college kitchens occupied the basement, a realm of ancient stone and modern steel where Tom Rook ruled with absolute authority. He was compact, weathered, with the hands of someone who had wielded knives with professional precision for decades. When he spoke of his missing cutlery, it was with resigned irritation, gesturing toward a wooden block beside the main preparation area. 2 knives from the main set, he explained. Nothing fancy, but properly balanced. Probably borrowed for some special function and forgotten in someone's pantry. His tone suggested this was merely the latest in a long series of minor domestic crises, but I found myself noting the particular precision with which he described the missing implements, as if their absence had disturbed some fundamental order in his carefully organized world. The wooden board bore outlines in white paint marking each knife's place, and one shape showed a smear where someone had recently rubbed at it with a damp cloth. In the college chapel, among carved saints and faded memorial tablets, the Reverend Edwin Priest received me with the gentle intensity of those who wrestle with questions admitting no final answers. He spoke of Helena Voss with genuine sorrow, describing her as a woman of deep faith who had struggled with competing demands of spiritual conviction and institutional responsibility. When he offered me tea, it came with a small prayer of gratitude that seemed as natural as breathing. His manner was gentle, almost apologetic, as if somehow responsible for the fact that divine providence had not granted Helena Voss a longer life. He suggested we might find comfort knowing she had died at her desk in service to the college she loved, offering tea and prayer as if both could absolve whatever darkness had settled upon St. Swithin's. Lydia Hart occupied guest quarters in the newer wing, a visiting novelist whose presence seemed to amuse rather than intimidate the permanent residents. She was perhaps 40, with the observant stillness suggesting perpetual mental note-taking for future fiction. When I interviewed her, she watched me with frank curiosity, someone accustomed to studying human behavior professionally. and I wondered what sort of character I might become in whatever story she was constructing from her temporary residence among the academics. She had known Helena Voss only slightly, introduced at a college dinner shortly after arrival. The warden had struck her as someone carrying private burden, someone who smiled at appropriate moments but whose thoughts seemed perpetually elsewhere. Writers, she observed, develop sensitivity to small discrepancies between public performance and private reality that most people either fail to notice or choose to ignore. Jonah Ellison inhabited the graduate quarters with the particular desperation of a young man who had discovered that academic brilliance provided no immunity against financial anxiety or emotional confusion. His rooms were spartanly furnished, containing little beyond books, papers, and accumulated detritus of someone living always on the edge of unspecified crisis. When he spoke of Helena Voss, his voice carried something that might have been gratitude or guilt, his eyes holding the hollow look of someone who had learned that good intentions offered little protection against poor judgment's consequences. He seemed lost in debts and longing, more victim of circumstance than active participant in whatever drama had unfolded within these ancient walls. Later that evening, examining the porter's logbook with Hobbes's reluctant permission, I discovered an entry made just after midnight on the night of Helena Voss's death. A Volvo estate, registration partially obscured by mud, signed in by someone whose handwriting was either deliberately disguised or naturally illegible. The porter recalled nothing unusual about the vehicle or its driver, only that it had departed before dawn, leaving no trace beyond that single cryptic entry. The timing struck me as significant, 12:17, and the line of numerals altered midway across the page as if the hand had tensed, or perhaps as if a different pen had resumed an hour later. My subsequent visit to the Randolph Hotel revealed another small mystery embedded within the larger one. Among guest register entries for that same evening, I found the name Elfrid Swancourt, a literary reference any devotee of Thomas Hardy would recognize immediately as the heroine of A Pair of Blue Eyes. The signature was confident, feminine, and almost certainly false, suggesting someone with both literary knowledge and taste for elaborate deception. The night clerk remembered nothing distinctive about the guest, only that she had paid in cash and departed early, leaving behind a room showing no signs of genuine occupation. These fragments settled into my consciousness like pieces of some vast puzzle, each detail suggesting connections remaining tantalizingly out of reach. St. Swithin's continued its ancient routines, members pursuing scholarly endeavors with dedication shown before Helena Voss's death. Yet beneath this surface continuity, I sensed currents of anxiety and suppressed knowledge suggesting the true story had yet to be told. The college solicitor maintained chambers in a narrow Georgian building on Turl Street, where the scent of old leather and older parchment seemed to emanate from the very walls. Mr. Pemberton was a man whose profession had carved permanent lines of cautious concern into his features, his fingers perpetually stained with fountain pen ink that had gone out of fashion decades before most of his clients were born. He received me in an office where dust motes danced in shafts of weak sunlight, filtered through windows so begrimed with Oxford soot that the morning light arrived like weak tea, apologetic and insufficient. The will lay before us on his mahogany desk, a substantial document bound in blue legal paper that seemed to carry the weight of more than mere mortality. Helena Voss had revised it only 3 weeks before her death, a timing that struck me as either remarkably prescient or deeply troubling. Pemberton handled the pages with the reverence of a priest managing sacred texts, though I suspected his reverence was reserved more for legal precision than divine mystery. His voice carried that particular hush lawyers adopt when discussing the final arrangements of the recently departed, as if death were a client who demanded discretion above all else. The original version, he explained with weary precision, had been straightforward enough. Modest bequests to distant relations, a legacy to a parish church she had never visited but never forgotten, and the residue to St. Swithin's College with a phrase that would have dampened even Marcus Bly's perpetually optimistic eyes. But the codicil, dated a fortnight before her death, had altered everything with surgical efficiency. She had diverted the college's most precious medieval manuscript, a 13th century illuminated psalter worth considerably more than most people earned in several lifetimes, from its intended home in the college library to an anonymous American collector, the proceeds designated for what she had described somewhat vaguely as essential capital improvements. The buyer's anonymity troubled me more than Pemberton seemed willing to admit. When I pressed him for details, his manner acquired that defensive opacity legal professionals deploy when they suspect their clients may have acted unwisely but cannot quite prove it. The transaction had been arranged through intermediaries who specialized in discretion rather than transparency, he admitted, and Helena Voss had seemed unusually troubled during their final meeting, distracted in a way that suggested she was wrestling with decisions that extended far beyond mere estate planning. The news of this alteration had already reached St. Swithin's, spreading through the academic community with the particular velocity that accompanies scandal. When I returned to the college that afternoon, I found Serena Keel in the medieval library, surrounded by ancient texts as if seeking comfort among artifacts that had survived longer than any human ambition. Her reaction to my questions about the will was immediate and visceral, her academic composure cracking just enough to reveal the fury beneath like ice splitting under unexpected pressure. "Betrayal," she declared, her voice carrying the particular venom academics reserve for colleagues who have violated the unwritten codes governing their profession. That manuscript had belonged to the college since the 16th century, she insisted, represented not merely financial value, but cultural heritage that no individual had the right to dispose of for personal gain. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, and I noticed how she gripped the edge of her desk as if anchoring herself against some internal storm. When she quoted Haussmann to emphasize her point, something about the futility of human ambition against the weight of history, I found myself listening with the particular attention I reserved for details that seemed almost but not quite correct. "Malt does more than Milton could," she said, "to make God's ways agreeable." The substitution was subtle. Haussmann's original line reads "can," not "could," but deliberate, I was certain. The past tense transformed the poet's observation about alcohol's consoling power into something more pointed, more accusatory, as if she were suggesting that Helena Voss's actions had been driven not by noble pragmatism, but by something more personal and more damaging. Yet beneath her fury, I detected something else, a personal wound that suggested this betrayal cut deeper than mere institutional loyalty. When I pressed her about her relationship with the late warden, her answers became evasive, filled with the careful language of someone who had learned to navigate between truth and discretion. They had been colleagues for 15 years, she said, had worked together on various academic projects, had shared certain intellectual interests, but her eyes held shadows that spoke of private conversations and personal disappointments that had preceded this very public betrayal. The matter of Jonah Ellison's bequest proved even more intriguing. Among Helena Voss's personal effects, she had left him a collection of rare books, primarily poetry and classical literature, volumes whose combined value would have resolved his financial difficulties completely. When I mentioned this to other college members, their reactions were uniformly uncomfortable, filled with meaningful glances and careful silences that spoke volumes about relationships they preferred not to discuss openly. The young man himself seemed genuinely surprised by the bequest, claiming no knowledge of why the warden might have chosen him for such generosity, yet his surprise carried an undertone of guilt that suggested he understood the implications, even if he could not bring himself to acknowledge them directly. Among the warden's papers in her private study, I discovered what I had not known I was looking for until it presented itself with quiet insistence. A carbon copy of a letter to Tom Rook, dated just 2 days before her death, lay among other administrative correspondence with the particular weight that mundane documents acquire when they become evidence. The subject appeared routine enough, a matter concerning kitchen inventory, but one phrase caught my attention with unexpected force. She had written about the matter of the knives which were misnumbered, using the plural form in a way that suggested she was referring to multiple implements rather than the single missing piece Rook had mentioned to me earlier. The phrasing was oddly formal for such a trivial matter, and I found myself wondering why the warden of St. Swithin's College would concern herself with kitchen cutlery numbering systems in her final days. The carbon paper bore the faint impression of another word from a subsequent sheet, barely visible unless one tilted the page at precisely the right angle to catch the light. Misnumbered. The indentation suggested a follow-up correspondence, perhaps a correction or clarification that had been deemed necessary. When I later showed this letter to Rook, his reaction was immediate and defensive, insisting that his inventory was always precise, that any numbering discrepancies must have been clerical errors rather than actual missing items. But his protestations carried the particular emphasis of someone trying to convince himself as much as his audience. It was Lydia Hart who provided the most philosophically satisfying interpretation of the entire affair. I encountered her sketching near the Bodleian, her notebook filled with observations that suggested she was constructing her own narrative from the fragments of college life she witnessed daily. When I mentioned the will, the sale of the manuscript, the college's apparent financial difficulties, she listened with that peculiar blend of detachment and intense observation that writers often possess. "Colleges own the past, Inspector," she said, closing her sketchbook with a soft snap that seemed to punctuate her observation. "They curate it, preserve it, sometimes even embalm it in their careful custody. But only writers," she added with a faint, wry smile that suggested she was including me in this category, "truly make use of it. We are the ones who dig beneath the carefully preserved surfaces, who find the stories in the dust and the drama in the dry facts." Her words lingered with me as I walked back through the college that evening, the shadows lengthening across stones worn smooth by centuries of academic ambition. She had articulated something I'd often felt but rarely put into words. The difference between mere possession and genuine understanding, between institutional custody and personal interpretation. Helena Voss had chosen to transform historical heritage into practical capital, converting irreplaceable past into fungible present. Serena Keel saw this as betrayal of the highest order. Jonah Ellison had received books as tokens of a relationship no one seemed willing to discuss openly. And somewhere in the administrative details, the mundane matter of misnumbered knives suggested complications that extended far beyond kitchen inventory management. As I made my way back to the station through the gathering Oxford dusk, I found myself thinking about the various threads beginning to weave themselves into something resembling a pattern. The altered will, the mysterious bequest, the oddly formal letter about kitchen cutlery, the literary pseudonym at the Randolph Hotel, all suggested a woman whose final weeks had been filled with decisions that extended far beyond routine administrative duties. Helena Voss had died at her desk, slumped over papers that might have contained answers to questions I was only beginning to formulate, taking with her secrets that had died before they could be properly understood or, perhaps more importantly, forgiven. The trout had always been kind to solitary men, and on that particular evening when the rain arrived with the persistence of unfinished business, I found myself seeking refuge in its familiar embrace. The Thames murmured past the windows with that eternal indifference water maintains toward human concerns, while inside, the scent of wood smoke and old timber created an atmosphere that seemed designed for contemplation. I had taken a corner table where candlelight flickered against the gathering dusk. My evening's companion, a cryptic crossword that promised the kind of intellectual distraction my restless mind occasionally demanded. The clue that held my attention with stubborn insistence read, edge turns twice in cutter, 5 letters. I stared at those words until they seemed to blur together, my pen hovering over empty squares as my brain performed the peculiar gymnastics that cryptic puzzles require. Edge could suggest border, advantage, the sharp side of a blade. Turns might indicate rotation, reversal, change of direction. Cutter implied something that divided, that separated one thing from another. The answer arrived with that sudden clarity that feels less like discovery than recognition of something that had been waiting patiently for acknowledgement. Parer, a small knife used for peeling, for removing outer layers to reveal what lay beneath. But it was not the satisfaction of solving the puzzle that caught my attention. It was the word itself, the suggestion of duplication embedded within it. The clue's emphasis on turning twice, on doubling, seemed to echo something larger in the mystery that had begun to consume my thoughts. Parer suggested not just a type of knife, but a method. The careful removal of surface layers to expose whatever truth lay hidden beneath. I found myself studying the newspaper photograph that lay folded beside my crossword, the image of Helena Voss in her office that had accompanied her obituary. She sat behind the massive oak desk that had served wardens of St. Swithin's for generations, but it was the background that now captured my focus with uncomfortable insistence. The wall behind her displayed 2 ceremonial knives crossed beneath a portrait of the college's founder. Not 1 blade, but 2. The realization settled upon me with the weight of understanding that had been delayed rather than absent. I'd been thinking in terms of singular elements, 1 missing knife, 1 mysterious death, but the crossword's emphasis on duplication suggested I should be considering pairs, doublings, things that appeared simple but were actually complex. The following morning found me once again in the college kitchens, where Tom Rook moved among his gleaming surfaces with the methodical precision of a man whose world depended upon order. He looked up from his inventory clipboard with the resigned expression of someone who had grown weary of explaining the obvious to people who should understand such things without instruction. "All knife are numbered, Inspector," he said, tapping the wooden block where his implements rested in their designated slots. The grammatical slip struck me like a discordant note in an otherwise perfect symphony. Not knives are numbered, which would have been correct, but knife are numbered, a curious mixing of singular and plural that suggested either fatigue or something more troubling. The man who prided himself on precision, who had spent decades managing kitchen operations with military efficiency, had stumbled over a simple sentence about his own organizational system. I pressed him gently about the numbering, watching as his discomfort became increasingly apparent. Each implement bore a small etched number, he explained, corresponding to painted numerals on the wooden block. Any discrepancy would be immediately obvious to anyone familiar with the system. Yet his explanation carried undertones of uncertainty, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as me that everything remained in proper order. The carbon copy of Helena Voss's letter about misnumbered knives seemed to whisper from my notebook, its formal language about kitchen inventory taking on new significance in light of his grammatical confusion. Marcus Bligh received me in his office that afternoon, surrounded by ledgers and financial statements that spoke of institutional pressures most academics preferred to ignore. His usually genial manner was shadowed by exhaustion, and when I asked directly about his role in Helena Voss's recent asset disposals, his response carried the weight of a confession that had been rehearsed but never quite perfected. "Yes, Inspector," he admitted, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his teacup. "I helped arrange the manuscript sale. The college faces significant financial challenges, and Helena believed that converting certain assets into capital would serve the institution's long-term interests." His voice carried that particular strain of someone who had participated in decisions he could not quite bring himself to defend. "Loyalty," he said, "sometimes requires silence." The phrase hung in the air between us like incense, suggesting bonds that extended beyond mere professional obligation into territories of personal complicity and shared guilt. The most intriguing development came through my encounter with the Reverend Edwin Preece, whom I found in the college chapel preparing materials for Helena Voss's memorial service. He had composed a poem in her honor, he explained with the diffidence that clergy often display when discussing their creative efforts. The verses were conventional enough, filled with references to scholarly dedication and spiritual devotion, but as I read them, something about their structure caught my attention with the persistence of a half-remembered melody. The first letters of each line, when read vertically, spelled out a word that seemed to shimmer with significance. Arcadia. The classical reference was unmistakable. The mythical realm of pastoral perfection, the idealized landscape where shepherds pursued wisdom in harmony with nature. But in the context of Helena Voss's death, surrounded by college politics and financial pressures, the reference seemed to carry undertones of irony or perhaps nostalgia for innocence that had been permanently lost. When I mentioned the acrostic to Preece, his reaction was immediate and uncomfortable, insisting that the arrangement was purely coincidental, that he had intended no hidden meaning. As I walked back through the college that evening, the shadows lengthening across stones that had witnessed centuries of human ambition and disappointment, I found myself thinking about patterns within patterns, about the way seemingly unrelated details could suddenly align to reveal structures that had been present but invisible. The crossword's emphasis on duplication, the ceremonial knives in the photograph, Tom Rook's grammatical stumble, Marcus Bly's defensive loyalty, Edwin Preece's accidental acrostic, all suggested that the truth about Helena Voss's death lay not in any single revelation, but in the accumulated weight of small deceptions and careful silences. The word para lingered in my consciousness like an echo, suggesting not just a type of knife, but a philosophy, the careful removal of surface layers to expose whatever truth lay beneath. And as I made my way through the gathering Oxford dusk, I found myself wondering what other duplications might be hidden within the apparently singular tragedy that had befallen St. Swithin's College, what other pairs might be masquerading as solitary elements in a mystery that was revealing itself to be far more complex than anyone had initially supposed. The investigation had begun to feel less like solving a puzzle than like performing surgery, each careful cut revealing new layers of complication beneath. Jonah Ellison inhabited 3 flights of narrow stairs in the graduate accommodation block, where the steps had been worn concave by centuries of ambitious young scholars, and still managed to trip the living with the ghosts of academic dreams deferred. His door bore the college's standard notice about visiting hours, a futile attempt at monastic discipline for people who had never mastered ordinary restraint. The corridor carried that particular scent of institutional poverty. Damp carpet, instant coffee, and the faint metallic tang of radiators that had given up pretending to provide adequate warmth. When he answered my knock, Jonah's face revealed the peculiar combination of pride and desperation that poverty teaches its most intelligent victims. He stepped back with the careful courtesy of someone who understood that dignity was often the only possession creditors could not repossess, allowing me entry to rooms that spoke volumes about the economics of graduate study at Oxford. The space was spartanly furnished with the desperate efficiency of someone who had reduced possessions to absolute necessities, yet beneath this obvious want lay unmistakable signs of fierce, almost defiant pride. His single bed occupied one corner, its coverlet pulled tight with military precision that suggested habit rather than display. The desk, fashioned from planks and bricks, supported towers of books that served as both study materials and architectural elements, creating small monuments to learning that reached toward a ceiling marked by water stains from winters past. A white shirt hung drying on the radiator, its collar frayed but clean, the kind of small maintenance that poor students perform as if poverty were a joke they must laugh at first. The smell of instant coffee and damp wool permeated everything, creating an atmosphere of genteel desperation that made me think, not for the first time, that poverty has a sound as well as a scent. "You know why I'm here," I said, framing the statement as the obvious truth it had become. He nodded and offered tea he could not afford to waste, handling the kettle with the particular care of someone who had once scalded himself and decided not to repeat the experience. The mug he provided was chipped, another small insult that poor students endure as part of their education in life's casual cruelties. He remained standing, as if sitting would concede too much, and began his protest before I had properly asked for it. There was nothing between them, he insisted, meaning Helena Voss and himself, not like that. She had read his work, advised him on his research, helped him compile reading lists for books he could never hope to purchase. She had been kind, he said, and kindness is a dangerous word among the young, carrying debts larger than money and more difficult to repay. His denial came with a particular emphasis of someone who had rehearsed the response but could not quite convince himself of its adequacy, his voice carrying that hollow ring of truth that has been carefully edited to remove inconvenient complications. I asked permission to examine his belongings, framing the request as courtesy. Though we both understood, I would have taken it regardless. He gestured toward his bookshelves with a small shrug that believed it had nothing to hide, and I found myself studying the way poverty had arranged itself among his possessions with an elegance that was almost defiant. Paperbacks creased into obedience, a small dictionary heavy with pencil dust, a Latin grammar scarred by previous owners and now his. All spoke of a mind that refused to surrender to circumstances that would have defeated lesser intellects. It was among the poetry that I found what I had not known I was seeking. A thin volume of Haussmann rested between weightier academic texts, its spine tired but not broken, the cloth cover yielding like the hand of an old friend when I lifted it from its place. The inscription on the flyleaf stopped me cold. Written in the precise, elegant hand I had come to recognize from Helena Voss's correspondence, the words read, "For Jonah, who understands that poetry offers consolation when philosophy fails." H.V. The date placed the gift just 3 months before her death, transforming what might have been a simple academic courtesy into something far more personal and potentially more dangerous. When he saw what I held, Jonah's carefully maintained composure cracked just enough to reveal the young man beneath the scholarly facade. His hands trembled as he reached for the book, and his explanation came in fragments that suggested a story he had never expected to tell. Helena had been lonely, he admitted, isolated by her position as warden and burdened by responsibilities that offered little personal satisfaction. Their conversations had begun as discussions of his research, but had gradually expanded to include matters of poetry, philosophy, and that peculiar melancholy which seemed to afflict sensitive souls trapped within academic institutions. My phone chose that moment to intrude with its weary hymn to urgency. Lewis, apologetic even across the electronic distance, delivered information that transformed these personal revelations into something more troubling. His methodical investigation had revealed a young man teetering on the edge of complete financial collapse, bank statements showing an overdraft swallowed by fees, rent arrears stretching back 2 months, a bursary application languishing for want of a support letter that had never arrived. The picture that emerged was one of escalating desperation, a brilliant mind slowly being strangled by the mundane realities of unpaid bills and institutional indifference. The discovery in Helena Voss's personal address book provided another piece of evidence that seemed to complete a picture I was beginning to wish remained unfinished. Among the carefully organized entries, Jonah's name appeared with a small dot beside his telephone number, a private notation that distinguished it from all others. The mark was in blue ink, a shade slightly different from the surrounding entries, as if added at a different time or perhaps with a different emotional weight. It was the sort of detail that spoke of particular importance, a connection that had evolved beyond mere professional acquaintance into territories more complex and more dangerous. Then came the testimony that seemed to seal Jonah's fate with mathematical precision. A kitchen porter, young and earnest, had come forward with memories that placed Jonah near the scene at the crucial time. He had been working late, preparing for the next day's breakfast service, when he noticed someone moving through the corridor that connected the kitchens to the administrative wing. The figure had been young, male, moving with the particular urgency of someone who wished to avoid observation. When shown Jonah's photograph, his identification was immediate and certain, delivered with that painful honesty which says, "I do not wish to be wrong, but I cannot deny what I have seen." The pieces assembled themselves with a kind of logical precision that should have brought satisfaction, but instead left me feeling hollow. A desperate young man drowning in debt and facing academic failure. A lonely older woman isolated by her position and burdened by institutional pressures. A relationship that had begun innocently but had evolved into something more complex, more dangerous. Financial desperation meeting personal vulnerability. Gratitude curdling into something darker when pressed against the sharp edges of immediate need. The scenario wrote itself with uncomfortable clarity. Perhaps Jonah had approached Helena that evening seeking assurance about his future, pressing for immediate assistance with his mounting debts. Perhaps she had refused, had attempted to maintain professional boundaries that had already been crossed in ways neither had fully acknowledged. Perhaps the conversation had escalated in the privacy of her office after the college had settled into evening quiet, emotions running high, desperation meeting resistance until something irreversible occurred. I found myself almost comforted by the neatness of it all, by the way complex human relationships could be reduced to simple equations of cause and effect. The evidence suggested a clear narrative that required only formal procedures to reach its inevitable conclusion. Yet as I prepared to leave Jonah's rooms, that comfort felt suspect, too complete, too perfectly arranged. The crossword clue about edges that turn twice lingered in my consciousness like a half-remembered warning, and I found myself thinking that the most dangerous solutions were often those that provided the greatest sense of closure. Lewis would want a tidy ending, the college would prefer discretion, and the evidence pointed toward Jonah Ellison with undeniable force. But comfort, I had learned through years of investigation, was often the enemy of truth, and as I walked back through the college that evening, I carried with me the troubling suspicion that perhaps the real mystery was not why Helena Voss had died, but why someone had been so careful to ensure her death would appear to have such an obvious explanation. The Randolph Hotel possessed that particular grandeur, which manages to be both impressive and subtly diminished, like an aging actress whose stage presence remains commanding despite the passage of unforgiving years. I returned there on a morning when Oxford fog clung to the streets with the persistence of unresolved questions, the city's ancient stones weeping their accumulated centuries into the October air. The hotel's lobby retained its Victorian confidence despite decades of careful economizing, brass fixtures gleaming because someone still believed that civilization depended upon such small acts of faith. The desk clerk who greeted me wore the expression of someone trained to remember faces while forgetting inconvenient details about their owner's nocturnal activities. The guest register lay open before me like a confession waiting to be interpreted, its pages filled with the careful signatures of academics, tourists, and the occasional mysterious visitor who preferred literary pseudonyms to legal identification. Elfriede Swancourt's signature appeared exactly where memory had placed it, confident and feminine, the handwriting of someone who had practiced deception until it became as natural as breathing. But it was the room assignment that struck me with uncomfortable precision. Number 247, positioned directly across the narrow corridor from 248, which had been occupied that same evening by Marcus Bligh. The proximity felt too deliberate to be accidental, too convenient to be meaningless. In a hotel of the Randolphs' considerable size, such arrangements suggested either remarkable coincidence or careful planning. The guest register's layout revealed that rooms had been assigned in sequence rather than according to any particular preference, which made the adjacency even more intriguing. The night porter, a veteran named Henderson, whose weathered features spoke of countless late-night arrivals and early morning departures, remembered the evening with the clarity that comes from years of professional observation. When I mentioned the Volvo estate, his memory sharpened like a photograph developing in chemical solution. He described it as a dark blue model, perhaps 10 years old, bearing registration plates obscured by mud in a way that seemed deliberate rather than accidental. The car had approached the service entrance with the cautious precision of someone unfamiliar with the hotel's layout but determined to avoid the main thoroughfare. Most intriguingly, Henderson recalled glimpsing the driver's wrist as car keys were exchanged. A delicate hand marked with freckles, brown as nutmeg against pale skin. The detail was precise enough to suggest genuine observation rather than constructed memory, yet specific enough to seem almost too convenient for investigative purposes. When I asked why he had noticed such a minor detail, he shrugged with the resignation of someone whose profession required attention to particulars that others would overlook entirely. My return to St. Swithin's that afternoon led me once again to the chapel, where Edwin Preece was arranging flowers for Helena Voss's memorial service with the gentle precision of someone who believed that beauty could somehow compensate for tragedy. His poem for the deceased warden lay on the altar, written in careful clerical script, and I found myself reading it with the particular attention I reserved for texts that seemed to contain more than their surface meaning suggested. The verses were conventional enough when read in traditional fashion, filled with references to scholarly dedication and spiritual devotion that would comfort mourners without challenging their assumptions. But something about the structure nagged at my consciousness with the persistence of a half-remembered melody. Acting on instinct more than logic, I began reading the lines in reverse order, beginning with the final stanza and working backward toward the opening invocation. The discovery struck me with the force of revelation that had been delayed rather than absent. The first letters of each line, when read from bottom to top, spelled out Lydia with unmistakable clarity. The arrangement could not have been accidental. Such precision required deliberate planning, careful attention to both meaning and structure. When I mentioned this discovery to Preece, his reaction was immediate and defensive, insisting that any pattern I detected was purely coincidental, that he had intended no hidden message within his memorial tribute. His protestations carried the particular emphasis of someone who had been caught in a deception he had not expected to be discovered. It was later that same afternoon when I encountered Lydia Hart on Broad Street, standing in a small independent shop that specialized in high-quality cutlery and kitchen implements. She held a paring knife at its bolster, testing the balance with the familiarity of someone who understood the relationship between blade design and practical application. The shopkeeper spoke in metallurgical devotions about full-tang construction and carbon steel composition, while she watched the blade's reflection consider her face with unsettling intensity. For research, she explained when she noticed my presence at her shoulder. A character who cooks badly. I know nothing about knives. The economy of the explanation was admirable, yet I found myself distrusting it in equal measure. The wrist that returned the implement to the display case bore the light freckling that Henderson had described with such precise detail, transforming his testimony from mere observation into potential identification. We walked out together into light that could not decide its season, the Oxford afternoon holding that peculiar quality of illumination that makes even familiar streets seem transformed. She asked about memorial services and the emotional climate of colleges when wardens die unexpectedly, questions that could have been mere curiosity or something more calculating. Voss was not beloved, she observed, merely obeyed. The phrasing echoed the porter Hobbes's earlier assessment, and such echoes create their own accusations in the mind of an investigator trained to notice repetitions. The evidence began arranging itself into patterns that felt both compelling and somehow too convenient. If Lydia Hart had harbored resentment toward Helena Voss, if she had arranged to meet Marcus Bly at the Randolph Hotel under literary disguise, if the Volvo estate with its freckled driver belonged to her, if her name was hidden in Priest's memorial poem, the connection suggested a narrative that was both plausible and deeply troubling. The novelist shopping for knives, the bursar with financial problems he described as loyalty, the college bleeding heritage into capital. It formed a structure no less elegant for being potentially sinister. Yet even as these theories aligned with mathematical precision, they began to dissipate like mist encountering morning sun. The Times slipped their constraints, receipts objected to convenient interpretations, and the testimony of a freckled wrist, however persuasive, could not upgrade itself to proof beyond reasonable doubt. I found myself oddly envious of Marcus Bly, which was less about Lydia Hart than about the shape of a life that still contained unspent possibilities, unwritten chapters where different choices might lead to different endings. Envy arrived like weather at the edges of my reasoning, fogging distances that should have remained clear. I imagined conversations in hotel corridors after midnight, imagined the shorthand of adults who understand the price of privacy and pay as they go. But imagination, I reminded myself with professional severity, is not evidence. It is the crime of the idle, the occupational hazard of those who spend too much time reconstructing other people's secrets from fragments and shadows. As evening gathered over Oxford, untying the city into smaller, more intimate lights, I walked to the river, where cold air organizes thought with ruthless efficiency. The theories that had seemed so compelling in daylight now appeared fragile, beautiful until wind interfered with their careful construction. Each element possessed the decency of coherence when considered individually, yet collectively they refused to form the solid structure that justice requires. I telephoned Lewis from the towpath, my fingers made serviceable by cold, and my voice rendered appropriately indifferent. Check parking records near the Randolph between 7 and 8 that evening, I instructed. Look for a dark Volvo estate with muddy registration plates. He asked questions I pretended not to hear, but he would do it, of course. He was the man who performed the mundane tasks that made deduction respectable, who transformed speculation into evidence, or, more frequently, evidence into disappointment. By the time I reached my flat, I knew only this. Sometimes the neatest story is the one life refuses to tell. I had envy enough for a younger man and suspicion enough for an older one, and neither would purchase the clarity I pretended to require. Oxford kept its counsel, the river maintained its secrets, and I, who had never particularly liked hotels, began to suspect that rooms were merely corridors, pretending to be destinations, that the real mystery lay not in identifying Helena Voss's killer, but in understanding why someone had constructed what appeared to be the perfect crime, with such literary precision that it suggested an author's hand rather than a murderer's desperate impulse. The past, I have learned through years of investigation, arrives not as revelation, but as accumulation, fragments that gather weight until they become impossible to ignore. On this particular morning, it arrived in the form of Mrs. Eleanor Bramley, an alumna whose wool coat had weathered decades of Oxford winters and whose handbag contained what she described, with characteristic understatement, as something that might interest me. She possessed that particular dignity which comes from surviving 8 decades without surrendering hope entirely, her voice carrying the measured cadences of someone who had learned that the world grows impatient with careful thought. She had matriculated in 1979, she explained, had coxed the women's first 8 before the college discovered its fondness for committees and lost its taste for risk. The photograph she extracted from a cardboard envelope, its edges softened by repeated handling, fixed 1983 in black and white certainty. A boat club dinner sprawled across the image. Young faces flushed with achievement and cheap wine, ties loosened, jackets abandoned to the peculiar democracy of celebration. But it was the centerpiece that caught my attention with uncomfortable force. A ceremonial cake bearing 2 knives crossed in a careful X, their blades gleaming in candlelight with the elegance of tradition rather than utility. "For luck," Mrs. Bramley explained, tapping the photograph's border with a fingertip whose nail had been painted without enthusiasm. "We crossed them after the speeches. It wasn't always done. Started that year. Somebody said it would keep the boys out of trouble on the water." She paused, considering the worth of a further sentence and deciding on economy. It did not. Among the faces gathered around that table, I recognized a much younger Helena Voss, her dark hair longer then, her expression holding the kind of unguarded happiness that seems to abandon people as they accumulate institutional responsibilities. Beside her sat someone whose features, despite 40 years of careful academic composure, were unmistakably those of Serena Keel, though her face then held none of the defensive precision that characterized her current demeanor. The college archives occupied a basement realm where centuries of institutional memory had been catalogued with the reverence of sacred texts. The archivist, Miss Pennington, possessed that particular devotion to paper that comes from understanding its fragility better than human frailty. She produced the volume for 1983 with the careful precision of someone handling evidence, its leather binding worn smooth by generations of researchers seeking truth in administrative prose. The pages marched through Lent and Trinity with ecclesiastical calm until I reached June, where Eight's Week should have sprawled across the diary in a litter of committee meetings and celebrations. Instead, there was absence shaped like information. A page had been removed with surgical precision, cut so close to the binding that only the thinnest strip of paper remained as evidence of its former existence. No accident, no hurried tear, but the work of someone who understood that evidence must be eliminated completely, or not at all. The next page bore an entry in a different hand, as if that week had required replacement personnel. The tone attempted administrative restraint and failed utterly. It recorded that the week's rowing had concluded prematurely, that a tragedy had occurred on the river, that the college wished to acknowledge the dignity of all involved and would hold a service of remembrance. No name appeared, no details, just the institutional diction of sorrow shaped to fit minutes that could be filed without shame. But along the margin, in pencil rubbed nearly to invisibility, I detected a word that had changed its mind. The first outline had been drowned, altered to accident, smudged to obscurity by an eraser that left the paper shiny under oblique light. Among Helena Voss's personal papers, filed in a folder marked Private Correspondence, I discovered a letter that seemed to illuminate the darkness preserved in those missing archive pages. Written on college letterhead but undated, addressed to someone identified only as S. The handwriting was Helena's, though younger and less controlled than the precise script I'd come to recognize from her administrative documents. The burden of silence grows heavier each year. The letter began, and I find myself wondering whether protecting the college's reputation was worth the price we have all paid in personal integrity. She wrote of sleepless nights and recurring dreams, of conversations that could never be held, and apologies that could never be offered. The letter spoke of a decision made by a small group who believed they were acting in everyone's best interests, though time had revealed the corrosive effect of secrets that demanded constant maintenance. At the end, she had added a sentence that seemed intended for herself alone. If we had spoken then, would we have saved him now? The final word was underlined, then scratched at, the ink broken into tiny islands of doubt, when I showed the 1983 photograph to Serena Keel. Her reaction was immediate and carefully controlled, her academic composure wavering just enough to suggest the image had awakened memories she had worked to suppress. She studied the faces with the intensity of someone reading text in a language once known fluently, but not spoken for decades. Her fingers traced the photograph's edge as if testing whether the past could be touched without being disturbed. "That was a long time ago, Inspector," she said, her voice carrying the particular weariness that comes from secrets grown too heavy to bear, but too dangerous to release. "We were all very young then, and youth has a way of making choices that seem reasonable at the time, but prove impossible to justify later." She spoke of Helena with a mixture of affection and resentment, describing a friendship destroyed not by betrayal, but by the weight of shared knowledge neither could bear alone. Later that evening, I found myself by the Thames where it curves past the college boat houses, the water dark and indifferent in the gathering dusk. The river moved with that eternal persistence that makes human concerns seem simultaneously urgent and meaningless, carrying its burden of silt and secrets toward destinations forever beyond investigation's reach. I thought about the photograph's crossed knives, ceremonial symbols that had somehow evolved into something more sinister, their image preserved in institutional memory like evidence of crimes never properly investigated. Standing where the towpath narrowed between willows whose hanging branches wrote cursive in books no one would read, I found myself thinking about the peculiar mathematics of guilt, how a single moment of poor judgment could compound over decades until it became a debt that could never be repaid. Helena Voss and Serena Keel had been bound together, not by friendship, but by shared complicity in whatever had occurred during that long-ago Eights week. Their relationship transformed from affection into mutual surveillance that lasted until Helena's death released them both from obligations they had never been able to fulfill. A single silence can shape a lifetime more profoundly than any spoken word, I realized. The secret they had kept had become the secret that kept them, defining their choices and limiting their possibilities until the past had consumed whatever future they might have claimed for themselves. The crossed knives in the photograph had been ceremonial, symbols of celebration rather than instruments of violence. Yet they had somehow become harbingers of tragedy, their doubled image echoing through decades like a visual rhyme that connected past guilt to present consequence. As I walked back toward the city center, college lights reflecting on dark water like fallen stars, I carried the growing certainty that Helena Voss's death was connected not to recent events, but to something that had happened 40 years earlier, when two young women had made a choice that seemed reasonable at the time, but had proven impossible to live with afterward. The investigation had led me not forward toward contemporary motives, but backward into the accumulated weight of institutional memory, where the real crimes were often those never officially recognized as criminal at all. The missing diary page, the coded letter, the ceremonial knives in their crossed formation, they were fragments of a larger narrative whose true ending had yet to be written. And as darkness gathered over Oxford, I understood that uncovering Helena Voss's killer would require first understanding the drowned boy whose name had been carefully erased from official records but whose ghost had haunted two women's lives for 4 decades, shaping their choices and sealing their fates with the inexorable logic of secrets that demand constant maintenance until they finally demand payment in full. The carbon copy letter waited on my desk like a confession written in disappearing ink, its faded blue text holding secrets that proper attention might finally unlock. I had returned to my flat as Oxford settled into its evening rituals, the city's ancient stones exhaling the day's accumulated warmth while I poured a modest measure of something consoling and arranged the day's evidence with the careful precision of a man who understood that truth often hid in the smallest details. The phrase that had been troubling me for days now refused to be dismissed. The matter of the knives, which were misnumbered. I read it again, my voice barely audible in the lamplight, parsing each word as if it were a line of particularly cryptic verse. Knives, not knife. The plural insisted upon itself with quiet obstinacy, transforming what I had initially dismissed as administrative correspondence into something far more significant. Helena Voss, a woman known for her meticulous attention to detail, would not have used the plural carelessly. But it was the verb tense that struck me with renewed force. Were misnumbered, past tense, suggesting the problem had already been resolved before she wrote the letter. Not are misnumbered, which would indicate an ongoing concern, but were, implying she was documenting something that had already occurred, rather than requesting action to address a current crisis. The grammar suggested aftermath rather than alarm, a record of correction rather than a call for investigation. I tilted the carbon copy toward the lamp, searching for the ghost impressions of subsequent correspondence that sometimes survived on such documents. The indentations were faint but unmistakable. Fragments of words from follow-up letters, dates that placed additional correspondence several days later, and what appeared to be Tom Rook's name followed by what might have been an explanation or apology. The following morning found me once again in the college kitchens, where Tom Rook moved among his gleaming surfaces with the methodical precision that had served him for decades. When I mentioned the follow-up correspondence, his reaction was immediate and uncomfortable. The response of someone who had hoped certain administrative details would remain buried in filing cabinets where they belonged. There was indeed a confusion, Inspector, he admitted, producing his own memo from a folder he handled with obvious reluctance. His written response to Helena Voss's letter revealed the same linguistic shift that had caught my attention in her original correspondence. Where his verbal reports had consistently referred to a single missing implement, his written follow-up spoke of knives, plural, and included references to numbering discrepancies that extended beyond simple inventory errors into territories of deliberate mislabeling. Most troubling was his description of discovering duplicate numbering. 2 different knives bearing the same identification mark, as if someone had attempted to disguise the presence of additional implements within his carefully catalogued collection. His earlier grammatical stumble returned to haunt our conversation. "All knives are numbered," he had said, mixing singular and plural in a way that now seemed less like fatigue and more like unconscious confession. The pathologist's office at the John Radcliffe Hospital provided the clinical precision necessary to transform linguistic suspicion into forensic certainty. Dr. Margaret Ashworth received me with the professional courtesy of someone accustomed to translating violent death into language that courts could comprehend without being overwhelmed by horror. When I pressed her about the specific characteristics of Helena Voss's wound, requesting details she had not included in her preliminary report, her manner acquired the defensive precision of someone who understood that every observation would be subjected to legal scrutiny. The wound showed evidence of 2 distinct cutting edges, she admitted after consulting her detailed notes with obvious reluctance. The primary injury was consistent with a single blade, but microscopic examination revealed what appeared to be a secondary pattern, as if the flesh had been penetrated by implements with slightly different characteristics. The angles were nearly identical, suggesting the wounds had been inflicted in rapid succession, but the edge patterns indicated different blade geometries, one slightly broader than the other, one showing the characteristic wear pattern of frequent use, while the other appeared newer, less weathered by kitchen service. 2 knives, not 1. The revelation settled upon me with the weight of understanding that had been delayed rather than absent. The crossword clue that had occupied my thoughts days earlier, edge turns twice in cutter, returned with renewed significance, its emphasis on duplication now acquiring a chillingly literal interpretation. The answer para had suggested not just a type of knife, but a philosophy of investigation, the careful removal of surface layers to expose whatever truth lay beneath. Walking back through Oxford that afternoon, I found myself thinking about language and its capacity for both concealment and revelation. Serena Keel's misquotation of Houseman returned to my consciousness with new significance. "Malt does more than Milton could," she had said, substituting the past tense could for the poet's original can. The alteration transformed Houseman's observation about alcohol's consoling power from present possibility into past limitation, as if she were suggesting that whatever comfort poetry might have offered had been exhausted by events that could not be undone. The past tense implied finality, a door closed rather than a resource available, and I wondered whether her misquotation had been deliberate commentary on Helena Voss's death or unconscious revelation of her own relationship to events that had shaped both their lives. The grammar of guilt, I realized, was written in plurals and past tenses, in verb forms that revealed more than their speakers intended. The overlooked detail had become the key, as such details often do in investigations that extend beyond surface appearances into the accumulated weight of institutional memory and personal shame. The ceremonial crossed blades in the 1983 photograph, the missing diary page from that same year, the letter speaking of silence and secrecy, all suggested a pattern that connected past ceremony to present tragedy with the inexorable logic of secrets that demand eventual payment. Standing in the college quad as evening shadows lengthened across stones that had witnessed centuries of human ambition and failure, I understood that the investigation had reached its crucial turning point. The physical evidence now supported what instinct had suggested. Helena Voss's death was not the desperate act of a single killer, but something more complex, more calculated, involving multiple participants and decades of careful planning. The neatness of Jonah Ellison's apparent guilt, which had almost comforted me with its elegant simplicity, now dissolved like mist in the face of this new evidence. A single knife, wielded in a moment of passion or desperation, could explain his involvement. But two knives implied something else entirely. A more deliberate act, perhaps even a shared responsibility, a complicity that extended beyond the immediate scene of the crime, into territories of institutional conspiracy and personal vengeance. As I made my way back to the station through the gathering Oxford dusk, I carried the certainty that tomorrow would bring confrontation rather than continued investigation, that the time for careful questioning had passed, and the moment for direct accusation had arrived. The plural wounds, the misnumbered knives, the past tense of Serena Keel's misquotation, they formed a structure of evidence that could no longer be ignored or explained away through academic courtesy and institutional discretion. Two knives, not one. The phrase echoed in my consciousness like a bell tolling the end of deception, marking the moment when careful lies finally surrendered to stubborn truth. The investigation had revealed its essential nature at last. Not a simple murder, but a complex ritual of delayed justice, performed with ceremonial precision by participants who had spent decades preparing for a moment they could neither avoid nor survive. The chapel at St. Swithin's possessed that particular quality of accumulated silence which seems to transform human whispers into something approaching prayer, whether the speakers intend devotion or merely seek the comfort of stones that have absorbed centuries of confession without offering judgment in return. I found Serena Keel there as the afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows, casting fragments of colored illumination across flagstones worn smooth by generations of penitents and scholars who had discovered that the distinction between the two categories was often meaningless. She occupied the front pew with the stillness of someone who had finally exhausted the energy required for deception. Her hands folded with academic precision, but her posture suggesting surrender rather than prayer. The chapel's acoustics, designed to carry whispered supplications toward heaven, would serve equally well for earthly confessions, and I suspected she had chosen this location with the same careful attention to symbolic detail that had characterized her scholarly career. "Inspector," she said without looking up, her voice carrying neither surprise nor protest at my presence. "I wondered when you would find your way here." The tone suggested she had been waiting not merely for my arrival, but for this moment of reckoning, as if our entire investigation had been following a script she had written years before but had only now decided to perform. I took the pew beside her, close enough for conversation, but distant enough to suggest that whatever followed would emerge from her own necessity, rather than my interrogation. The silence stretched between us like a bridge neither was eager to cross, filled with the accumulated weight of decades and carefully maintained deceptions that had finally grown too heavy to bear alone. "You understand about loyalty, Inspector," she began, her gaze fixed on the brass cross above the altar where candles flickered with the persistence of institutional memory. "Helena and I were friends once, before the college came between us, before ambition taught us to see each other as obstacles rather than allies. We shared everything in those early years: books, ideas, dreams of academic achievement that seemed possible when we were young enough to believe intelligence could overcome institutional politics." Her voice carried that particular melancholy which comes from remembering happiness that had been genuine but temporary, affection that had been real but insufficient to survive the pressures of professional advancement within an institution that demanded loyalty while rewarding betrayal. She spoke of loving Helena once, not romantically but with the fierce devotion that sometimes develops between brilliant women trapped within systems designed by and for men who understood neither their intelligence nor their frustrations. "The betrayals began small," she continued, her hands moving restlessly as if seeking something to hold or perhaps something to release. "Committee appointments that should have been shared, research opportunities that mysteriously became unavailable to younger scholars, the gradual erosion of trust that occurs when friendship must compete with career advancement. I forgave much because I understood the pressures she faced, the impossible balance between personal integrity and institutional survival that academic leadership demanded." "But the manuscript sale," she said, her voice acquiring an edge that transformed disappointment into something sharper and more dangerous, that was a line too far. "That Psalter had belonged to the college for 4 centuries, had survived the Reformation and Civil War and 2 world wars, only to be sold to some anonymous American collector for what Helena called essential capital improvements." She spoke the phrase as if it tasted of betrayal, her academic composure finally cracking to reveal the fury beneath. The chapel's silence absorbed her words like stone absorbing rain, neither approving nor condemning, but simply witnessing another human confession in the long catalogue of such moments these walls had contained. Outside, the college continued its ancient routines, but within this sacred space-time seemed suspended, waiting for truths that had been rehearsed in solitude but never spoken aloud. I entered her rooms that evening after evensong, she continued, her narrative acquiring the measured cadence of someone who had practiced these words in private but never expected to voice them. Helena was at her desk, surrounded by papers documenting the college's financial difficulties and her proposed solutions. When I confronted her about the manuscript, she defended her decision with the cold logic of someone who had convinced herself that pragmatism justified any sacrifice of principle. Serena paused, her gaze moving to the memorial tablets that lined the chapel walls, generations of college members whose names had been carved in stone as if permanence could compensate for the brevity of human achievement. She seemed to draw strength from their silent witness, seeking permission from the dead to finally speak truths the living had found too dangerous to acknowledge. "There were 6 reasons to act," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The manuscript was only the most recent betrayal. There was the matter of the drowned boy whose death we had concealed, the research she had stolen from younger scholars, the way she had used her position to destroy careers that threatened her authority. Each offense had been rationalized, justified, excused, until the pattern became undeniable and action became inevitable. The ceremonial blade from her office wall was for show. She continued with clinical precision that was more troubling than passion would have been. Beautiful, but impractical, more symbol than instrument. The true knife came from the kitchens, properly balanced, sharp enough to do what needed to be done quickly and cleanly. Tom Rook's inventory confusion was deliberate. I had borrowed the implement earlier, replaced it with a similar one bearing duplicate numbering, creating the discrepancy Helena noticed and documented in her final correspondence. Her words confirmed what the pathologist's examination had revealed. 2 distinct edges, 2 different blade geometries, 1 ceremonial gesture, and 1 practical solution. The wound pattern had been designed to confuse forensic analysis, to suggest accident or natural causes, while ensuring the result was both swift and certain. She spoke of the act itself with detachment that transformed violence into something approaching scholarly methodology. When I asked about Lydia Hart, Serena's expression softened with something that might have been compassion or recognition of kindred spirits. "Lydia is a half-ghost, Inspector," she said with surprising gentleness. "Someone who observes life without fully participating in it, who understands the weight of secrets without being crushed by them. She deserves mercy, or at least solitude, not the burden of involvement in affairs that were settled long before she arrived at St. Swithin's." The reference suggested a deeper connection than casual acquaintance, a shared understanding that extended beyond the immediate circumstances of Helena's death into territories of mutual recognition and perhaps even tacit approval. Lydia had been witness rather than participant, observer rather than accomplice, someone whose literary sensibilities had recognized the narrative necessity of what had occurred without requiring direct involvement in its execution. As we sat in the chapel's ancient quiet, surrounded by stones that had absorbed centuries of human confession and divine indifference, I found myself thinking about the mathematics of justice, how decades of small betrayals could accumulate until they demanded payment that could only be satisfied through decisive action, how institutional loyalty could transform into personal vengeance when the gap between public virtue and private corruption became too wide to bridge through rationalization alone. Serena Keel had killed Helena Voss not in passion, but in careful judgment, not as sudden impulse, but as delayed justice administered by someone who had appointed herself executor of a sentence that would never be pronounced in any official court. The chapel's silence seemed to absorb her confession as it had absorbed countless others, offering neither absolution nor condemnation, but merely the ancient comfort of stones that had witnessed every variety of human failing and continued to stand despite the accumulated weight of guilt they had been asked to bear. The confession ended as quietly as it had begun, with Serena returning her gaze to the altar where candles continued their vigil against darkness, both literal and metaphorical. She had not admitted guilt directly, had not used words that would make arrest inevitable, but she had provided sufficient detail to transform suspicion into certainty, theory into evidence that could support conviction in any court willing to listen carefully to what had been said and what had been deliberately omitted. 2 knives, not one, and a wound placed where consolation could never reach. The past had chosen its instruments with scholarly precision, and the present had obliged with institutional efficiency. Somewhere in the college, life continued its ancient patterns, but here in the chapel, surrounded by the accumulated weight of centuries, justice had finally found its voice in the whispered confession of a woman who had loved too well and forgiven too much until forgiveness itself became impossible, and only action remained. The machinery of institutional justice moves with peculiar efficiency when confronted with truths too complex for public consumption. Chief Superintendent Strange summoned me that morning with the weary authority of a man who understood that messy human tragedy must be transformed into manageable administrative procedure. His office smelled of weak coffee and bureaucratic impatience, the windows fogged with Oxford mist that refused to acknowledge the changing season. He wanted what he called a tidy ending, Inspector, he said, arranging case files with the precision of someone who believed paperwork could impose order upon chaos. The college has suffered enough disruption, and discretion serves everyone's interests better than publicity. His meaning was clear without being explicitly stated. Some confessions were meant for chapels rather than courtrooms. Some justice administered through resignation rather than prosecution. The phrase administrative resolution carried weight that extended far beyond its bureaucratic simplicity. Strange's vision of tidiness would be achieved through the ancient strategies that Oxford institutions deployed when confronted with inconvenient truths. The college wanted silence above all else, and silence, I discovered, was something they purchased with surgical efficiency. St. Swithin's adjusted with the resilience of an organism that had survived countless disruptions over its centuries of existence. The governing body met behind closed doors, emerging with decisions reached through consultation processes invisible to external observation, but devastatingly effective in their implementation. The official narrative would emphasize natural causes, while any suggestion of institutional conspiracy would be quietly discouraged through the deployment of legal resources and academic influence. The Reverend Edwin Preece found himself guilty of nothing more serious than literary inadequacy. His memorial poems, hidden acrostic, revealing itself as unconscious association rather than deliberate communication. His only crime was bad poetry, which, while regrettable, fell outside criminal jurisdiction and within the broader category of academic embarrassment. When I examined his printed order for the memorial service, I noticed he had bracketed initial letters for the verger's guidance. Small a, large R, small c, and the pattern stumbled and recovered, assembling itself vertically into that old word again. Arcadia kept appearing like a habit he could not abandon, a pastoral dream that haunted his clerical imagination. Jonah Ellison was cleared by the machinery of poverty itself. Bank cameras capturing his presence at a cash point on Parks Road. Laundrette records documenting his shirts committed to heat and institutional witness at the crucial time. The evidence that had seemed so compelling dissolved under scrutiny like morning mist encountering sunlight. He was left with a different kind of failure. Not the guilt of violence, but the shame of having been suspected. The peculiar burden that comes from being cleared of crimes one never committed, but which others had found plausible enough to investigate. The rare books bequeathed to him by Helena Voss provided financial relief that arrived with emotional complications he had not anticipated. The volumes represented not just monetary value, but the weight of a relationship he could neither fully acknowledge nor completely deny. He would complete his studies, I suspected, but the experience had left marks that academic success would not fully erase. Marcus Bligh submitted his resignation with the quiet dignity of someone who understood that institutional loyalty sometimes required personal sacrifice. His departure was framed as pursuit of other opportunities rather than acknowledgement of impropriety, his role in the manuscript sale technically legal, but ethically questionable. His genial warmth would be missed, but his exit served the college's need for symbolic renewal without requiring uncomfortable questions about financial pressures that had driven recent policy decisions. Tom Rook responded to the investigation's revelations by transforming his kitchens into an armory with a conscience. Etched numerals were repainted in scarlet enamel. A ledger required signatures and times and purposes. A steel cabinet accepted blades at night and offered them by permission at dawn. On the wall, 2 knives of the same model hung side by side, their polished faces indifferent. I noticed a crescent of scratches on one bolster, a faint scallop where an overzealous scouring pad had insisted on purity, while its twin bore a different history of use. Softer, less linear, a patina from stews and Sunday joints. They had changed places at some point, been returned out of sequence by a hand that wanted resemblance more than truth. Hobbs, the porter, had acquired new details for his logbook. He had seen the Volvo again, he said, but in daylight and with less mud, idling at the north gate while someone in a blue coat signed for a parcel. He mentioned the wrist without prompting, the freckles like spilled tea and the small crescent scar below the thumb. Left hand, he said with the satisfaction of someone who had found the answer to a crossword clue that had bothered him all morning. I thought of the cutlery shop on Broad Street, of Lydia Hart balancing a small blade until the point found the stillness that steadies steel. It was Lydia Hart who provided the most philosophically satisfying commentary on the entire affair. Her letter arrived on cream paper that pretended not to have been chosen, brief in the way that suited both of us. Oxford makes historians of its policemen and policemen of its historians, she wrote, the observation carrying weight that extended far beyond its apparent simplicity. The city transforms everyone who stays long enough, teaching us to see the present as merely the most recent layer of accumulated past, to understand that every crime has its precedents and every solution its complications. She spoke of departure, of a novel that had found its ending in the corridors and chapels of St. Swithin's College, of characters who had revealed themselves more complex than fiction typically allowed. The investigation had been educational for both of us, she suggested, though perhaps in ways neither had anticipated when it began. I filed her letter with the quiet papers, the ones that would never be requested by any court and would only ever be read by the man who wrote the case notes that surrounded them. The memorial service proceeded with solemn efficiency, Priest reading his poem with earnestness that forgave him more than craft ever would. A choir of undergraduates made a sound like forgiveness, trying to remember its lines. Serena Keel did not attend. The sub-warden spoke of stewardship and difficult decisions and honorable traditions of service. No one mentioned the river. When the bell tolled, it did so without flourish, a low acknowledgement that a page had been turned in a book that preferred not to admit chapters at all. The college adjusted the way old buildings do, by not moving while the light changes. A cleaner replaced the warden's blotter and left the imprint of paper clips in the drawer like a constellation whose mythology had been misplaced. The library's illuminated psalter was discussed in committees that avoided the word sale and adopted the word stewardship with renewed devotion. Notices were removed, notices were posted, a portrait was rehung 2 inches higher, and thereby authority was reasserted on the wall if nowhere else. Strange had his tidy ending, the college had its silence, and I had the peculiar satisfaction that comes from understanding that justice sometimes arrives through channels that exist outside official recognition. Serena Keel had disappeared from Oxford as quietly as she had lived there, her resignation accepted without fanfare, and her departure unmarked by ceremony. The truth had been spoken in the chapel's ancient quiet, and heard by stones that had absorbed countless other confessions without requiring formal response. As I walked through Oxford that evening, the city's lights reflecting on dark water like fallen stars, I carried the knowledge that some truths survive not because they are officially recorded, but because they are privately understood. The case was closed in all official senses, filed away among other resolved matters, but the real mystery had been not why Helena Voss died, but how institutions managed to transform human tragedy into administrative procedure with such devastating efficiency. 2 knives, not one, and wounds that belonged less to anger than to administration. The investigation had revealed not just a murder, but the peculiar mathematics by which colleges calculate the cost of truth against the price of silence. In Oxford, that passes for justice more often than we care to admit. The White Horse had always understood the particular needs of solitary men, and on this November evening when rain arrived with the persistence of unfinished business, I found myself seeking refuge in its amber-lit embrace. The droplets traced irregular patterns down windows that had grown opaque with accumulated moisture and decades of Oxford weather, each following gravity's inexorable logic, while creating designs that seemed almost deliberate in their randomness. From the radio behind the bar came the opening notes of La Bohème, Puccini's meditation on love and loss, arriving with the precision of cosmic irony that seemed to govern my recent investigations. The pub's warmth carried familiar scents of old timber and older secrets, while I occupied a corner table where candlelight flickered against wood scarred by generations of carved initials and abandoned hopes. My glass reflected the flames' dance, amber liquid holding light the way memory holds truth, imperfectly but with stubborn persistence. The opera's melancholy seemed appropriate for an evening spent considering what I had come to think of as the administrative tidiness of grief, the way institutions managed to transform human tragedy into manageable procedure with surgical efficiency. Helena Voss had been dead for 3 weeks. Her memorial service concluded with appropriate solemnity, her affairs settled with the discretion that Oxford colleges deployed when confronted with inconvenient truths. The official narrative emphasized natural causes and institutional continuity, while any suggestion of deeper complications had been quietly discouraged through the deployment of legal resources and academic influence. Strange had his tidy ending, the college had its silence, and I had the peculiar satisfaction that comes from understanding that justice sometimes arrives through channels that exist outside official recognition. I found myself thinking about misquoted poets, about the way Serena Keel had altered Hausmann's observation about alcohol's consoling power from present possibility into past limitation. Malt does more than Milton could, she had said, substituting could for the poet's original can, transforming verse about temporary comfort into something more pointed and more accusatory. The past tense implied finality, a door closed rather than a resource available, and I wondered whether her alteration had been deliberate commentary on events that could not be undone through any application of literary consolation. The photograph from 1983 haunted my thoughts with persistent clarity. Young faces gathered around a ceremonial cake, 2 knives crossed in careful formation above the celebration. The doubled blades had been symbols of tradition rather than instruments of violence. Yet they had somehow become harbingers of tragedy, their image echoing through decades like a visual rhyme that connected past ceremony to present consequence. 2 knives, not 1, the pathologist had confirmed, and in that duplication lay the key to understanding not just Helena's death, but the peculiar mathematics by which institutions calculate the cost of truth against the price of silence. My phone chose that moment to intrude with its electronic hymn to urgency, Lewis's name appearing on the small screen like a question I was not prepared to answer. I watched it ring through its programmed sequence, each note carrying the weight of professional obligation and personal reluctance. He would be calling with updates about administrative procedures, about paperwork that required signature and reports that demanded completion. The machinery of justice moved forward with relentless efficiency, transforming human complexity into manageable categories that could be filed and forgotten. When the ringing stopped, silence returned with the weight of reprieve. The phone vibrated once more, then fell quiet, and I imagined Lewis in his methodical way, noting the time, the lack of response, the small administrative detail of an unanswered call. Some conversations, I had learned, were more valuable for not taking place, allowing space for the kind of understanding that words could only diminish. Tomorrow there would be reports to file, summaries to write, but tonight belonged to the opera's lament and the rain's patient work against glass that had witnessed countless similar evenings of contemplation. The crossword in my jacket pocket remained deliberately unsolved, its grid of empty squares mocking my earlier confidence in the power of logical deduction. Edge turns twice and Cutter had yielded its answer, para, but the solution had brought complications rather than clarity, suggesting duplication where I had expected singularity, complexity where I had sought simplicity. One clue remained, stubbornly blank, something about termination and tact, 5 letters, and I found myself reluctant to complete it. The unsolved square served as reminder that some puzzles resist completion despite our best efforts at logical analysis. Edges, I found myself thinking as I watched rain merge and separate on the window, do not meet at points, but fray with use. The phrase arrived in my consciousness with the weight of revelation that had been delayed rather than absent. Sharp boundaries between guilt and innocence, between justice and revenge, between institutional loyalty and personal integrity. All all had proven more complex than initial examination suggested. The investigation had revealed not clean divisions between right and wrong, but gradual erosions of moral certainty, places where principles had been worn smooth by the accumulated pressure of competing loyalties and impossible choices. Understanding, I realized with uncomfortable clarity, does not always bring comfort. The knowledge I had gained about Helena Voss's death, about the decades of accumulated betrayal and delayed justice that had culminated in her murder, carried weight that satisfaction could not balance. Serena Keel had acted from motives that were both comprehensible and unforgivable, her violence emerging from wounds that time had deepened rather than healed. The drowned boy, whose name had been carefully erased from official records, continued to haunt the living, his ghost demanding payment that could only be satisfied through decisive action. The opera reached its tragic climax as Mimi breathed her final notes, love and death intertwining with the inevitability that Puccini understood better than most composers. I finished my drink and prepared to venture back into the rain, leaving the crossword unfinished in my pocket, where it could remain both incomplete and alive. The habit of leaving room for error, I had learned, was one way of resisting the smugness of solved things. The walk home took me through streets where lamplight struggled against gathering darkness, past college walls that had absorbed centuries of human ambition and disappointment without offering judgment or absolution. My footsteps echoed against stones worn smooth by generations of scholars and servants, criminals and saints, all pursuing their various purposes with the dedication that Oxford seemed to inspire in equal measure. The city continued its ancient routines, indifferent to the small dramas that occasionally disturbed its scholarly quiet. A fox crossed ahead of me on Parks Road, its tail a punctuation mark the sentence could not do without, pausing to consider whether I posed any threat before disappearing into shadows that knew their business better than I knew mine. The rain had softened to mist that exchanged knowledge in whispers with my coat, and I found myself thinking of archive pages that remembered even when they obeyed, of pencil marks that could be erased but never entirely forgotten as I reached my flat, key turning in a lock that had grown familiar through repetition rather than affection. I carried the quiet ache of knowledge that would never fully heal. The investigation was complete in all official senses, filed away among other resolved matters, but the real mystery had been not why Helena Voss died, but how human beings managed to transform love into hatred, loyalty into betrayal, justice into revenge through the accumulated pressure of time and circumstance. Inside, I left the radio silent, allowing the night's natural overtones to fill spaces that music might have cluttered. The crossword remained in my pocket, its empty square a small white monument to uncertainty, and I found myself grateful for its incompletion. Some puzzles, I had learned, were more honest when they refused to be solved, acknowledging the limits of human understanding without pretending that logic could illuminate every shadow. The ache of knowledge, once acquired, proved remarkably persistent in its refusal to be soothed by any application of reason or time. It settled where such aches always settle, quiet, unrelieved, dignified by nothing but endurance. Outside, Oxford kept its counsel, the rain maintained its secrets, and I, who had never particularly liked administrative tidiness, began to understand that the most honest conclusions were often those that resisted conclusion entirely, leaving room for the kind of truth that could only be lived rather than solved.